My name is Gustavo Arellano. I'm a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, covering mostly Southern California. How to say it? Southern California, everything, and a bit of the West and beyond. I'm also the host of the Times Daily News from the LA Times, which is which is the LA Times Daily podcast. So that's where me just trying to tackle the news of the world. But if I have to introduce myself, well, I'm the child of immigrants, both of them Mexicanos from the state of Zacatecas. My mom came here, quote unquote, legally because my grandmother was born basically as a refugee in Arizona. And my dad, on the other hand, during the Mexican Revolution, and my dad came to this country in the trunk of a Chevy in 1968. And that wasn't the first time he came here without papers. So I'm the oldest of four. The only language I spoke when I entered kindergarten was Spanish. Here I am speaking most of my life in English now. Hablo como un pocho, pero sí puedo hablar el español. And and thank you for offering me sort of how I want to introduce myself, because central to who I am and central how I view the world, and especially the United States, is through the story of my parents. And my mom ended up becoming a tomato canner with a union job. She was a Teamster until her packing plant closed down in 1997. My dad ended up becoming an American citizen because of the amnesty of Reagan of '86. He was a carpet cutter before he injured himself. Then he was a truck driver for 89, 99, 96, like about 30 years. And now he's happily retired. Well, not happily retired because my mom passed away 2 years ago to cancer. And we're still all, and including myself, still processing that loss. But no, so that's my life.
Oh, the story of us is the story of the generations before us, Gustavo. I think I relate so much that I couldn't answer that question without talking about my family. And that makes me curious to know, when did you realize that you were Mexican American, that you were bicultural? You talk a lot about that identity, and I'm curious if there's a moment where you realized, oh, this is who I am.
It's weird because a lot of my life was run, because I just recently spoke to Latino, ¿cómo se dice? Like a Latino youth conference, but for men, where, people who were born, I'm sorry, I still need to learn the language on that, but, people who identify as male, let's put it that way, who identify as male. And so I talked to them about the struggle that I historically have had, for a long time in my life, of trying to identify as un hombre, because my parents, they come from villages. Somos, no somos rancheros. We were farmers. Pero when you come from small villages up in Zacatecas, you're born with this very macho mentality, very much, and in the best and the worst ways. Best is really just a sense of community, taking care of yourself. And the worst way, we know, the misogyny, the homophobia, and all of that. And that was the world that I was brought up in. But I never liked it. Desde chiquito, I did not identify with thinking that women were, se deben de domar, they should be dominated, that LGBT folks should be ostracized, racism. At least I'm not saying this is the experience of all people from El Rancho, but this was my experience. And so I try to rebel against that. And so I identified more with being an American. That's not to say I completely rejected what I grew up with. So I love the cultural stuff. Again, I think the hard work for me, I've always seen hard work coming from Mexicanos, from like the Mexicanos in my life, as opposed to the quote unquote Americans in my life. I've actually frankly found mostly the Americans being lazy AF, but that's a whole other conversation. And I remember I'd get into these fights with my cousins and friends growing up all the way through high school. No, I'm American. I'm not Mexican. I'm American. I'm American. Yeah, my parents are Mexican, but I'm American. But the light switched on for me in 1999 when one of the trustees for the high school district that I graduated from, Anaheim Union High School District, he announced that he wanted to sue Mexico for $50 million for educating the children of undocumented immigrants. So that would apply to me, this American, pocho, all of that. Since my dad was undocumented, that would apply to me. And the reason was because this trustee was saying that people like me were ruining Anaheim schools. And that just pissed me off to no end, because I'm like, no, I went through those schools. I saw all the undocumented kids, quote unquote. They were band geeks. They were everything that we're supposed to be in the American high school system. Band geeks, stoners, cholos, rebels, like all of that. we did everything. It was basically like Riverdale High in the Archie comics, except 90-some% Latino, most like super majority Mexican, but we had a big population, of course, of Salvadoreños, Guatemaltecos, and a few Hondurans and Costa Ricans, not too many South Americans, and a couple of Caribbeans as well. And it just angered me. So literally in my mind, I'm like, okay, so despite whatever I might want to do in my life, you're just gonna look at me as a Mexican, and worse words than that. I'm not gonna say those worse words right now, but like, no. So that's actually what pushed me into activism, which led into journalism, and finally got to me this idea that I can be both. I can be Mexican and American, and I'm proud of both of them. Most of the times nowadays, I call myself just Mexican, and what I always say is, como se dice, that there's a quote by Sergio Cadiz, this legendary muralist in Southern California, who said that my idea of being American is to be as Mexican as I want.
I love that. I love that, Gustavo. And I imagine that sentiment is in part what led you to start this column, Ask a Mexican, to share esa mexicanidad with the audience of Southern California. Tell us a bit more of how that came about.
So Ask a Mexican actually started as a joke in November of 2004. What happened was, throughout the year, we were doing a column called Burning Bush. And by we, the former newspaper I used to work at, OC Weekly, I was in charge of a column called Burning Bush, where we would publish conservative critiques of George W. Bush in the lead up to the election, because, of course, we despise W. And the column was going to end, of course, after the election, whether he won or he lost. So it ended, and we needed to fill in the space for that week. And so my editor at the time, he's like, I remember we were just talking. He comes one day, we're on the 5th floor of a building, and he's like, hey, I just saw a billboard for the Spanish language DJ, and I've never heard of this guy before. Have you heard of him? And it's weird because he's wearing a Viking helmet. He has his eyes are crossed, all silly. And his name's Pylon. Have you ever heard of Pylon before? I'm like, oh, you're talking about El Piolín. Exactly.
Of course.
And the Pulso audience is going to know who El Piolín is. Just in case you don't know, I'll explain. So El Piolín at one point was the biggest Spanish language DJ in the United States. This interesting mix of like advocacy journalism, where he'd have on teachers, doctors, social activists, trying to tell his listeners, which was working class Latinos, hey, this is how you get ahead in this war in the United States, mixed with a lot of sexist humor. That sexist humor ended up getting him at the end, because he ended up getting fired over allegations of sexual harassment. For for posterity's sake, he was one of the main drivers or inspirations behind the huge amnesty marches of 2006. Him and El Cucuy and all these other Spanish, along with all these other advocacy groups, they really helped make these, at that time, the largest marches in American history. And so I told my editor at the time, his name was Will, I told Will, like, this is what El Piolín is. More importantly, you should know that El Piolín, when he first came to the United States, undocumented, he ended up in Santana, in Orange County, California. And I said, you're pretty stupid for not knowing who El Piolín is, because he's a big name. And you're being stupid, not because you're a white person and white people are supposed to know everything about Mexicans, but because you're the editor of a big newspaper. You should know what's going on in your backyard. It doesn't matter what ethnic group it is. You should know. And he's like, you know what? There's a lot of people who are ignorant about Mexicans, like me, and not being racist. He wasn't racist at all. He just literally did not know who El Piolín is. So he said, why don't we do column ridiculing that ignorance. And I told them I wasn't interested in it, not because I thought it was offensive, the idea, but because I thought people wouldn't care for it. And as a reporter, you want to do stories that people are going to care for. And not everyone does, sadly, but that's where you go. You're not going to do a story that doesn't matter, So, but we had that hole in the coverage. So I'm like, okay, fine. I'll do it. So I go back to my desk. And I think to myself, and the whole thing was like, this could be a safe space, if you will, for people to send in their questions about Mexicans, and you could answer them. And so I'm like, I thought to myself, okay, I think this is a dumb idea, because I don't think people are going to like it, but let's just go with it. What's the stupidest question someone could ask me about Mexicans? And for me, it was the one that Will would ask me again and again. Oh, why do Mexicans call white people gringos? And I'm like, Obviously, gringo, a lot of Latinos call white folks gringos, but that's not what I grew up with. I called, in my part of Mexico, we call them gabachos. And gabachos also is a word that people use as well. So I remember that was a question. I'm like, I'll go with that. And so it was literally, Dear Mexicans. Since it was supposed to be an advice column, you always address the person as dear. Dear Mexican, why do Mexicans call white people gringos? And my response was, well, dear Gabacho, because in my mind it's like, look, if you're gonna be calling me a Mexican, I'm gonna call you what your ethnic group is, because hey, it's gonna be politically incorrect. So I said Mexicans do not call gringos gringos. Only gringos call gringos gringos, and Mexicans actually call gringos Gabachos. So we publish it. We give it the name Ask a Mexican with an upside down exclamation point because, hey, you're asking a Mexican. And then I put my email at the very bottom. I said, hey, if you have any spicy questions about Mexicans, ask them to me, not thinking anyone ever would. And historically, no one reads newspapers. Well, I mean, no one reads newspapers anymore, but people still do advice columns. So you look at Hola Papi, Hola Papi has even in his book, he has a logo of him typing away and all that. So you always want to see how your columnist looks like one way or another. So for me, I wasn't going to put my picture because, well, a lot of people, I've never been mistaken for Mexican in my life. People always think I'm like everything but Mexican, whatever with that. So I'm like, well, if this is supposed to be an advice column about Mexicans, then we need to put a quote unquote Mexican. So that's where we came upon the caricature that was a logo for Ask a Mexican. And even here on the podcast, like you don't have to see this, but I could paint you the picture and the listener know exactly what I'm talking about. So big fat Mexican guy with a bushy mustache, stubble on his neck, gold tooth, leering grin, beady eyes, bandoliers across his chest, giant sombrero. This is the Mexican that's been in the minds of Americans for, at this point, more than generations. I'm doing the math right now. 50, 60, 70... 170 years, basically since Texas seceded, if you will, from Mexico. So this is the bandito archetype. So in my mind, I'm like, if you think there's a Ask a Mexican, that's the Mexican you're thinking about. So it was just like meta, satirical, all with the intention of ridiculing gabachos, clueless gabachos. So we published the column, not expecting anything out of it. But who was I kidding? Of course, anytime you write about Mexicans, anything, people are going to be upset. People who hate Mexicans hated the column. People who liked Mexicans hated the column. But people who hated Mexicans liked the column. People who liked Mexicans loved the column. So it was all this mix. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Because, again, we're talking about Mexicans. But then what I didn't expect was for people to start sending me questions. So I go back, a lot of questions. On that first day, the day that the column first publishes, which is Thursday, we got 50 questions, like within hours, immediately. So I go to my boss and I tell him, what do we do with all these questions? He's like, well, let's just answer them until, yeah. No, plus you remember, it was supposed to be a joke column. It was supposed to be one time only. I'm like, I got other stories to do. But he's like, let's just see how far this column goes. So let's just answer questions until there's no more questions to be answered. Well, that was November of 2004. The column ended in October of 2017. So that's 14 years. Eventually the column expanded to 2 questions a week every week. It was a best-selling book. So in other words, the questions never stopped. I must have answered, God, again, I'm terrible at math, but 2 questions a week times 50 weeks, that's 250 questions a week, thousands of questions. I answered thousands of questions about Ask a Mexican. Also, in the best-selling book, half of the questions were only exclusive to the column. I still have in my secret archives all the questions I never answered. And basically anytime I'd get a question, and I would take the better of the duplicate question. So if different people ask the same question, I'd just get the funniest written one and then keep it. My document was Microsoft Word, Times New Roman, 12-point single-spaced font. It was 220 pages of questions I never answered.
Wow, Gustavo.
And it wasn't just gabachos who were asking them. It was everyone. Everyone had a question
for you. Who was submitting the questions?
Everyone. At the end, like if I had to do a demographic breakdown, it was like 40% Latinos, 40% gabachos, then 10% like varying 10 to 15% Asian Americans, 10 to 15% African Americans, all the other groups involved, like thrown in there. But it's interesting because in early days, I would get a lot of racist questions, but you have to remember, like, the columnist has the last laugh, the columnist has the last answer. So when people would ask racist questions, oh man, I would get at them with a metaphorical baseball bat. And by the way, racist questions weren't just coming from Mexicanos, or rather from Gabachos. Mexicanos, I would say I was the most ruthless to Mexicans who were racist against, especially black folks. But anyone, I remember one of the last questions in the last year that I did ask a Mexican, some idiot Mexicano starts talking all sorts of trash about Central Americans. And so, do you remember those old Mad Libs? Yeah, so I'm like, I read it. I'm like, oh man, your question is so dumb. You're literally a Mad Lib. So I took his question and I turned it into a Mad Lib, and this is American racism for 100 ever since the immigration era. So this is American racism for 130 years. And why do fill in the blank of the latest group you hate does fill in the quote unquote quirk of the group that you hate all the way through. And like my point was, you're stupid. You're just as racist as people from the past, but in this case, you're Mexican and you're racist against Central Americans. You should know better. Look, I get the tensions. Tensions are always going to exist. But nosotros the Mexicanos, people talk about Mexican hegemony. I think that's a whole thing, that I don't necessarily agree with. But I will say this, that us as Mexicans, we are the biggest group, we got to be better than the Gabachos. Being racist against other groups, especially Central Americans, we're not better than Gabachos. Frankly, we're worse.
No, that resonates a lot, Gustavo, and we see it as well as we're unpacking all of the difficult conversations we're having in Pulso now, that it's hard to talk about the nuances of the discrimination and racism within our community, as we're also fighting that as a group against what we experience in the US against ourselves. So it is complicated. And as you tell us these questions that are kind of like the most outrageous, I'd love to know what were some of the most heartwarming or endearing questions that you got.
I mean, I literally got everything. Horrible questions, hilarious questions. For me, heartwarming, it's because, people say now, especially now, people say like, oh, the column was this, and that. And my response to that is it was a column of its time. I would still be doing the column right now, frankly, if I hadn't left the paper. Although looking back in the past, I would change definitely some of the ways I would approach some of the questions. But one of the things that people have to remember, it's a satirical column. So when you're a satirist, you play the idiot in order to make a bigger point. Like, I didn't mind being the buffoon, because being the buffoon meant if being the buffoon meant I could teach people something about Mexicans, then I would. But getting to the heartwarming part, in other words, it's, como se dice, it's anecdotal, but I'm not going to say, oh, ask a Mexican changed the world. I would never say that. I can say, though, that I got a lot, dozens, if not hundreds of questions over the years. People, or not questions, responses. Oh, thank you. Thanks for asking Mexican. It really taught me to be proud of my Mexican roots when I was in high school. I mean, I'm now old, so I'm now at the point where people are saying, I was reading you in high school, which I'm like, well, ya estoy viejo, but whatever. I was born old. So those were heartwarming. And, other people just say like, how can I learn? My favorite ones were just, hey, I want to get more into Mexican culture. What are some books I should read? What are some activists I should follow? What should be some music I would follow? So every year, I would have a Christmas shopping list. It's like, as you can tell behind me, I'm a nerd, so I love books. So here are the books you should buy. Here are the books you should buy this year. And that was great. And it would lead to sales for these authors. It would lead to sales. So that would make me happy. So anytime I could give a plug, the point of Ask a Mexican was always to, it was to debunk and deconstruct stereotypes and misconceptions about Mexicans in a way that educated, infuriated, and entertained. And it was the whole point of Ask a Mexican was always to punch up, never down. Was I successful all the time? No, not at all. I'll admit that. But I was way more successful than I ever failed. I would say that.
That's a beautiful legacy, Gustavo. That is a beautiful legacy to that column that we still keep talking about today, and that had so much impact. And I think one of the reasons why it was so successful is precisely that satirical tone that you took. Can you tell us more about why humor and why that was a mechanism to accomplish this debunking of stereotypes that you sought out with the column?
I've always loved humor. I mean, right now I'm speaking in front of a bookcase, all of jokes, all of studies of humor, all of that. Desde chiquito, I love seeing like Tom and Jerry, Cantinflas, El Chavo del Ocho. And what I always loved about humor is that it was a great eradicator. You know, when you have so much, como se dice, bifurcation, that's a fancy word, inequities. There you go. So many inequities, los ricos, los pobres, and all that. But with humor, you level all of them down. And because of the power of that, you've seen this throughout society. The power, los poderosos, the powers that be, you could shoot at them, you could throw bricks at them, you could yell at them, you could protest at them. They don't care. They don't care. They're always going to have bigger guns than you, bigger bricks than you, all of that. What they cannot stand ever is being ridiculed. They cannot stand that. That's why, you know, when it comes to bad times, they round up the political cartoonists. They round up the humorists. They're always the first ones because they're the ones. I've always said this. I think the two most essential characteristics of humanity is humor and hope. And the minute we lose the both of them, we're not humans anymore. At that point, we lose the will to live. We always want to laugh. We always want to think that there are better ways to do so. Or, you know, that there's a better life más allá. And so when I started doing Ask a Mexican, once I realized like, okay, this is a thing. Now this is where I have to talk a little bit about my background as a reporter. So in Orange County, I covered a lot of hate groups, like literal bona fide neo-Nazis, all sorts of stuff. And that's where I quickly realized that, you know, making fun of them, they hated that. So if I was going to do Ask a Mexican as a commentary of how ignorant people were about Mexicans, then yeah, I was going to use humor. That was the only way. And also, you know, porque puedo ser sangrón de vez en cuando. In the early 2000s was a time where every newspaper had a Latino columnist, and I just got annoyed by these Latino columnists. And they were good people, but literally every single story they would do is like, oh, Latinos were just so misunderstood, and if people only misunderstood us, then they would like us. I'm like, no, they're almost apologetic for who we are. And for me, I'm like, no, I'm not going to apologize for who I am. I'm not going to apologize for my parents. I'm not going to try to explain to people. People should understand who I am. But if I have to explain to you, then I'm going to make fun of you before not getting me already. So that was always el sentido de Ask a Mexican, just satire. And satire, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but satire is this great comedic and political vehicle where the satirist makes an idiot out of himself in order to make a bigger political point. And those political points is always about speaking truth to power. You think of the great satirists throughout history, Jonathan Swift, Mark Twain, Stephen Colbert, now he's more like mainstream, but when he was on the Colbert Report, like all that, they all spoke truth to power. They all exposed, to use that cliche, they all showed how the emperor had no clothes. Better, you know, more than just like, insults with humor are better than insults. Insults are just insults. Anyone could say, oh, you suck, you're stupid, you're racist, whatever. No. Get to how stupid they are. Get into it. Annoy them. Again, insults, the power that be, they're used to the insults. But the jokes, the humor, they're not used to that because we're supposed to be scared of them. Well, I was never scared. I was never scared of white supremacy, I guess. I was never scared of white supremacy, and I was never scared of calling out our own people for our own stupidities. And a lot of people are both of those, and they don't want to get into that.
As I think of all of this that you're sharing, and I think back to when this column started 17 years ago, how do you think the perception of Mexican Americans has changed since that time? Has it improved? Are we in a better place than when you started?
Aye. Well, you know what I'm noting is more Mexicans are becoming conservative. So, I mean, explain the support for Trump. Explain all these pendejos out there, people who do not want to get vaccinated. Explain why a column I just wrote today. Explain why Latinos are the only ethnic group in California who are in favor of the recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. Never mind that if Newsom gets recalled, then we're gonna have a bunch of like lunatics, Republican lunatics in charge of California. What is happening to Latinos? It's what I call, by the way, in Ask a Mexican, you know, because when people would ask me, you know, why do you make fun of Guatemalans so much in Ask a Mexican? The point I was making was that I'm trying to make the point that that Mexicans are just as American as anyone else, as if not more so. And part of that, ¿cómo se dice? Part of that education for Mexicans is to be as anti-immigrant as previous generations of of immigrants. And it's not something that people wanted to hear. And I'm not going to say that Mexicans are more accepted now, but we have definitely become more assimilated, even, despite all the stuff that we are going through, and despite all the anti-immigrant hate, we're more assimilated now than ever before. It's just a reality, and it's not a reality that most people want to hear, but it's happening.